King's Cross is a church committed to fully enjoy and share with others the life, grace, and restoration that can only be found in Jesus. If you are unable to visit us on Sunday mornings, you can learn more about King's Cross at kingscrossva.org.
Our scripture reading comes from Matthew chapter 26, verses 1 through 16. You can find this on page 8 in your worship guide. When Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified." Then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, "Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people." Now when Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came up to him with an alabaster flask of very expensive ointment, and she poured it on his head as he reclined at the table. And when the disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, "Why this waste? For this could have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor." But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you trouble the woman? For she has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. In pouring this ointment on my body, she has done it to prepare me for burial. Truly, I say to you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." Then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?" And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he sought an opportunity to betray him. This is the word of our Lord.
I can imagine how big decisions are made because, of course, Karen and I have made big decisions. Maybe some of you work in a business setting in which you're making big decisions all the time. And when making big decisions, it generally goes something like this. There's a couple of plans that are offered as the group gets together, a husband and wife, but also I can imagine a boardroom. And these folks get together and they throw out a couple of plans, maybe a plan A, a plan B, a plan C, a plan D. And they talk about the various plans, the pros and the cons. And there are always advocates for one plan over another, and the advocates are generally chatty people, and they'll advocate for plan A. But plan B will also have a chatty advocate. Plan B advocate will speak up as well. And again, there could be far more than just two plans, but the plans get discussed. And hopefully over time, one of those plans begins to make more sense. Or it could be that those who are opposed to a certain plan, their opposition is answered in some way such that they no longer oppose it. And that becomes the plan that most of the people in the room like, and then they pursue that plan. Maybe this paradigm is familiar with some of you, or all of you, I hope. It's just decision-making, weighing plans, speculating about the future, advocating, and then finally pursuing one of those plans. Now, the passage that we're looking at this morning is a passage that falls right on the heels of the completion of a sermon. Jesus, in fact, has preached a rather lengthy sermon. Much of it has been rather confusing to the disciples. But almost without skipping a beat, Matthew 26, verse 1, it immediately goes into something that seems unrelated to that sermon. But what's happening is we see in this passage that there's two plans. And it may be that one of these plans is one way to respond to the preaching of Jesus, and another plan, well, it's another way to respond to the preaching ministry of Jesus. That's what I want us to see in this passage. We're looking at two plans, but when we make decisions, we select one plan and we pursue that one for a while until we learn that that wasn't the best plan, and then we set that one aside. We pursue the one that was originally neglected. But in this passage, there are two plans. And the two plans are both running in parallel. There's a plan A with an advocate, and there's a plan B with an advocate. And they're actually being pursued by these representative advocates in parallel at the same time. And that's what I want us to see as we look at this passage. We have two plans, and each of those plans has a main advocate, a champion who is pursuing that plan. But here's what I want us to understand about the entire passage. It's simply this, that Jesus pursues God's plan, and our response is worship. Jesus pursues God's plan, and our response is worship. Now, I need to, of course, show you what these two plans are, and I'm going to do that. And then I need to show you who are the champions or the advocates for these two plans and how they pursue them. And I'm going to do that as well. But I also need to this morning ask you a question as I close the sermon. And the question will be something like this: which plan is yours? Which plan will you advocate for? Which plan will you live according to? When I begin to ask that question, you'll see that the conclusion of the sermon is coming. There's two plans, though. We need to talk about that. You see in the first two verses that there is this plan, a plan for crucifixion. As I said, Jesus, he's just preached, hasn't he? Matthew 24, Matthew 25. That's all a single sermon of Jesus. And in that sermon, there are numerous unanswered questions. Here's just a few of them. When will this destruction that Jesus is talking about happen? That is the destruction of Jerusalem, the temple. What will be the sign for the end of the age? Jesus has kind of answered that question. When will be the end of the age? He certainly hasn't answered that question. And what are we to do in the meantime? There's a parable at the end that Jesus uses to focus their attention on that. But still, there's a lot of questions about what we're supposed to be doing in the meantime. And we expect his next words to be a kind of a summary, almost as if Jesus preaches, then there's a pause, and then there's a Q&A. Isn't that how we would do it? He would preach, and there's a pause, and there's a Q&A. But there's neither a pause nor a Q&A. Jesus says this, you see then in verse 1, when Jesus had finished all these things, that could be everything he said, not just this sermon, all these things. He said to his disciples, you know that after 2 days the Passover is coming. On one level, this is a very obvious thing to say. April 15th is tax day. July 4th is Independence Day. And December 24th is, well, you get the point. On the one hand, it's a very obvious thing to say, but notice what Jesus says afterwards. He says in 2 days the Passover is coming, but immediately Jesus says the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. This is instead of a Q&A following that sermon. You notice that Jesus says here that he will be handed over. You see, delivered up or handed over to be crucified. So Jesus is saying that there's going to be other agents that are involved. Now, the disciples, and we should know this as well, only knew that only Rome has the power to actually crucify. So if Jesus is going to be crucified, on some level, the greatest power in the world at the time needs to be an agent of this. The Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified, handed over by the world's power. And if he's handed over by the world's power, surely the religious leaders are going to be involved as well. We've seen enough of Jesus' preaching ministry in Matthew to know that. But I want us to notice this, that when Jesus says the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified, do you sense any argument that Jesus has for that plan? Do you sense any editorial comments, any annotations by which Jesus would say, not the way I would do it, not sure I'm happy with this plan? Jesus completely accepts this plan In 2 days, the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. Now, he's saying this will happen in 2 days. I wonder if that would put a little bit of energy under the feet of the disciples. Perhaps some of them are thinking that this is not my plan. We'll get to that later. But as Jesus was very vague in the sermon about when the final judgment would come, when will the second coming happen? Here Jesus is quite clear, 2 days. Now, this is Matthew's first use of the word Passover. Now, if you were a Jewish person hearing Jesus say this, and you're in Jerusalem for the very celebration of the Passover, what I'm about to share with you would certainly not need to be shared, but I'm going to share it with you. That the Passover was a celebration of the Hebrew people having been delivered from Egyptian captivity. Now, how that deliverance from Egyptian captivity took place was known by all of the disciples, in fact, probably everyone in the city of Jerusalem, but I'm going to say it to you anyway. Deliverance from the Egyptians happened by God doing something. God acted. He is the one who delivered them. And the way God delivered them is by killing the firstborn of the Egyptians, while at the same time passing over his own firstborn, which is what his children are called as a people. The children of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob are together God's firstborn. And the way the firstborn of God's own people were preserved or passed over was by blood, the blood of a lamb. A special lamb that had been prepared for this special task to be sacrificed and whose blood would be painted on the doorpost and the lintel of every house. And it would be that blood that would be a marker. And so God would preserve those who were underneath that blood. When I see blood, God says, I will pass over you. Now, already we sense that this death of Jesus is God's plan to save us. And we sense that not only in the teaching ministry of Jesus, this would be the third time here in verses 1 and 2, the third time that Jesus has said that he must die. But the disciples would have known this in the history of the Old Testament. And we should have sensed that this was God's plan to save his people just by looking at the story of redemption in the Bible, that God sacrificed a lamb as a means of saving his people in Egypt, blood for deliverance. And that commemoration is coming. It's going to be the very event that is celebrated this week, the last week of Jesus' earthly ministry prior to his death. And now, in 2 days, God is going to sacrifice another lamb, isn't he? And the blood of this lamb will be a greater Passover, won't it? This blood will, like that blood, deliver God's children. And Jesus, he will be that final sacrifice. Remember what John the Baptist called Jesus, the Lamb of God. And this very week is a celebration of the Passover. And the Passover is on the mind, but the Passover is on the mind because it's the very story of God in the entire Old Testament, right up to this point. And so now you hear the first plan. He said to his disciples, you know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. But let's set that aside for a moment, because in verse 3 we see another plan, don't we? Set that plan aside, and let's look at not a plan for crucifixion, but a plan that we should call murder, the plan for murder. You see in verse 3, it even feels like a plan. You look at this with me. Verse 3, the chief priests and the elders gathered in the palace of the high priest and plotted together. You see all of that. All of those words tell us that something rather formal is happening. It's like that boardroom conversation of the variety of plans available to us. Which one will we choose? You see, the word priest there is plural. It's probably a representation, not merely to the high priest. There technically is only one high priest, but the high priest as well as the father-in-law of the high priest, but probably the plural means the religious establishment is unanimously in agreement. The priests agree. Everyone who has authority agrees. You see, in verses 3 through 5, we're looking at a formal plan. You see their goal, don't you, in verse 4? To arrest Jesus by stealth and to kill him. And that's what Matthew tells us. To arrest Jesus by stealth and to kill him. The problem is really the stealthiness. And let me tell you why. You see, the feast the following week is the Passover. And after the Passover feast, well, ordinarily everyone would return home, and presumably Jesus and his disciples after the feast, they would return home. And if they return home, it's going to be harder to arrest and kill. But at the same time, there's a great event that's happening, and it's going to be very difficult to secure Jesus, to arrest Jesus, when the cacophony of the crowds is all around, and surely it's going to make it into the press. And so the challenge is not the arrest and it's not the killing. The challenge is the stealth. They have to do this somehow. That's stealthy. Now, in the Greek, the word stealth refers to deception. They have to do it deceptively. Now, this is a terrible, terrible plan, isn't it? This is a wicked plan. Focusing on a man. They're going to get their man, and they're going to kill their man. But there is a sense in which we have a very minuscule sympathy with their challenge. These are people who are powerful. They have a lot of weapons at their disposal. In fact, they have a lot of cash at their disposal. And yet there's this one problem. Even though they believe they have the legal right to arrest him and to turn him over to Rome to be killed, they don't want to ruin the festivities. Well, I said minuscule sympathy. Maybe it's not even that. But we get their challenge, don't we? These two plans, this plan for crucifixion, and then what we've just looked at, this plan for murder, do you know that both of these plans have actually been going on for generations? As I said earlier, the plans are running in tandem, and we're going to see that as the advocates pursue their plan. But the plan of crucifixion has been going on for more than generations. Remember, when God promised to deliver Adam from the curse, he said that it would be by an offspring of Eve, crushing the head of the devil. There's the very beginning of this plan. That was in the garden. That's Genesis chapter 3. And Adam and Eve and Noah later expected God to deal with judgment of sin in his own way. All three of them and their family were aware that they lived their lives under a curse and that sin needed to be dealt with. That's what Noah's Ark is about. Wood graciously saving from God's judgment. Adam and Eve and Noah, they expected that God would have to deal with sin, and he's surely going to deal with it in his own way. And then Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses, now all of them expected a sacrifice of some sort. Don't you remember that God had asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac? And the notability of sacrifice had been woven into their DNA as a people. They understood that the way that God is going to deal with this sin and with this curse under which we live is a sacrifice of the innocent. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, they all expected a sacrifice of some sort. And so there's a real sense that this lamb that was sacrificed, that God might pass over them, it actually made sense. And then the burnt offering that was prescribed by the people, even in the wilderness, to make regular burnt offerings to God, this made sense to the people. That God's judgment has to be dealt with, and he deals with it through sacrifice. God's people expected in the future at some point this kind of figure, and he would be a combination of a prophet and a priest and a king, and somehow he would usher in this new covenant by which sin is finally and completely dealt with, and the people can experience God's love minus the curse of sin and judgment. Now, that plan for crucifixion is not new, but nor is the plan for murder not new. For generations, people who should have worshiped God rebelled against God. Remember that Adam and Eve were not long in the garden before they themselves agreed against God. They agreed to rebel against him, to twist themselves out of his plan, to follow their own desire for the fruit because they did desire the fruit and they ate. And the Hebrew people is a collection of tribes, as a nation with a king, as two nations with two kings, as exiles and as humbled tenants of Persia and then humbled tenants of Rome. They knew that they were a people who were prone to killing the prophets. The nations chased after the same gods of their Mesopotamian and Persian and Roman neighbors, and the Jewish people murdered their own prophets. Remember, just before Jesus began his sermon, he said these words, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it." And this is actually very important for us to notice, that this plan for crucifixion is not new, and this plan for murder is not new either. Neither of them are new. They're both very old, and neither of these plans are operating at one time. As I said earlier, they're running in parallel. So those are our two plans, and we actually have two advocates that are pursuing these plans. And by pursuit, that's exactly what I mean. We have these advocates, and we actually get a glimpse of what it looks for them to pursue the plan for crucifixion and to pursue the plan for murder. This wonderfully detailed story of the advocates of each of these plans. Would you look then at verse 7, and you see the advocate for the plan for crucifixion, don't you? It's a woman with an alabaster flask. And the plan for murder has an advocate as well. And this advocate actually is named, as you can see from verse 14, Judas Iscariot. And each of these advocates, don't they pursue their plan? As we investigate these pursuits, here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to reverse the order, and I want to use Judas Iscariot as an example of someone who is pursuing a plan, and he's pursuing the plan for murder. Recall that plan for murder. Highest religious authorities plotting together to arrest Jesus, then to kill Jesus. They can envision how they arrest, they can envision how they kill, but it's the stealth, it's the deception that's hard. And Judas Iscariot is one of the disciples. He's been in the shadows so far in Matthew's gospel. We've not heard very much about him. However, when he is introduced as a disciple in Matthew 10:4, Matthew was sure to tell us that Judas Iscariot is the one who betrayed Jesus. And the word Iscariot is odd. Interestingly, it may be related to the Aramaic word for a liar, Judas the liar. It could be that. It could also be that Judas is from a small village called Cariot. Maybe Iscariot comes from that. We actually don't know. But when Judas Iscariot comes onto the scene, here's one thing we do know. He is perfectly situated to help the plan for murder. I mean, we're not told how Judas heard about the plan for murder, but he knows that he can become the man of the hour. Guess what they're lacking? Well, they're lacking stealth. And Judas can in many ways say, if stealth is your need, I'm your man. How remarkable this pairing is. And we see in verse 14, don't we, that it's Judas who actually goes to the chief priests. Again, priests in the plural. It's like he goes to all of them. And he says, "What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?" Isn't that interesting? Deliver him over to you. This is what Jesus said would happen. And they have an answer. By the way, verse 15, it seems like it's a fairly speedy answer. 30 pieces of silver, paid in advance. And Judas has to do some quick computation to determine if this is really worth it. But may I share with you that Judas is very good at these kinds of computations. He is an accountant. He's the treasurer of the disciples. We're not told that in Matthew's gospel. We're told in John's gospel twice that Judas is the one who managed the money bag. He was a trusted member of the disciples. But what John also tells us, you can look at this for yourself in John chapter 12. What John tells us is that Judas had some kind of sin that he was dealing with in the past, and the sin was thievery. And sometimes those old sins, they present themselves freshly again. And John actually tells us that Judas would occasionally help himself from that very money bag of the disciples. I'm not sure why exactly Matthew doesn't give us this background material, but it's good for us to understand, isn't it, that when they say, these chief priests, 30 pieces of silver, this is exactly the man who can compute in his head. That's 120 denarii, and a denarius, well, that's a day's wage. So 30 pieces of silver is about 4 months of salary. Some of you may see in your study Bibles that some commentators think that this is a high price. Some commentators think that it's a low price. I guess both are right. It is a low price for the life of a person, far lower for the life of Jesus. But at the end of the day, it's not a bad haul. How would you like a 4-month paid vacation? And it works out for Judas, doesn't he? And I want you to understand that Judas is pursuing the plan for murder. This is what it looks like to pursue that plan. And notice in verse 16, the job description that Judas has now. He takes the money, it was paid in advance, and look at his job description. From that moment, he sought an opportunity to betray Jesus. Let's think about that for a moment. What kind of a job description is verse 16? Can I say to you that this kind of job description is one in which Judas needs to be alert? And at the close of Jesus' sermon, didn't he just say that you need to be alert? But not for this. Alert for the second coming. Watch your life. Judas is kind of doing that, isn't he? He's alert for the moment that he can betray Jesus. What about the advocate for not the plan for murder, but the plan for crucifixion? And go back in our passage and look at verse 6. Judas is the advocate for one plan, and this woman with an alabaster flask, she is the advocate for another plan. You see, during Jesus' last week, Jesus and his disciples would seem to have spent their nights in Bethany, at least most of their nights. So during the day in Jerusalem, and at night they would return to Bethany. We don't know who this Simon the leper is, but Matthew tells us that he's present. Now, he certainly doesn't currently have leprosy, but he was known for having leprosy at one time, and it's very likely that Jesus healed him of his leprosy. He became a follower of Jesus, and in the local church, the nickname stuck. I'm not sure that Simon would have necessarily minded the nickname Simon the leper. It said something about how Jesus has helped him. And the woman is not named, but in John chapter 12, we learn that she is told that she is named Mary. This is the sister of Martha. This is also the sister of Lazarus, which means Simon, he's there, and he was once a leper. And this woman, she's there. And this Lazarus, whom we're not said is there, but if he is there, he would pair nicely with Simon, once cured from leprosy, and Lazarus, well, once cured from death. And when they were having a meal, this very evening, this woman approached Jesus, and without a word, she broke a flask of ointment and poured it all over his head. Now, that should sound weird, and the story is told as if it was quite weird. During the meal, anoints him over his head. And the detail about the flask and the breaking of the flask is important. Right over his head. Now, this isn't the first time that Jesus has been anointed with nard or with ointment, with oil. But this is the only time it happens in his last week before his crucifixion. When it happened before, it was before Gentiles. So this would have been very odd for Mary to do this. and it would have made a scene, but there's something that commentators often don't talk about, but I think they should. And that is that this room, this house, would have been completely filled with the aroma of whatever was in that alabaster flask. It would have made the nostrils burn. We're told specifically that it's not oil, it's nard, which it's a fragrance in its concentrated form that would be then cut with just a little bit of oil. But when the disciples saw it, you see in verse 8, they were indignant, they were furious. And we're actually told why. What a waste. That's what Matthew tells us. When the disciples saw this, it stood out to them. It was noticeable. It was burning the hairs of their nostrils, and they had an opinion about it. This is a waste, totally unnecessary. And it seems as though the disciples, in one accord, were in agreement with this. What a waste. Now, we need this for background, and again, I'm not sure why Matthew doesn't share this detail. But in Mark's gospel, we're told that the value of this ointment is 300 denarii, a year's worth of wages in that alabaster flask, whereas the 30 pieces of silver were a quarter of the year for the murder of an innocent man. Now, we certainly know that the disciples are indignant, they're furious, and this may disappoint us. We're let down by the disciples, but it's not the point of this narrative. The point of this narrative is what this woman is doing. And what this woman is doing is a flamboyant excess of love and worship. It's over the top. It's extraordinary. And she holds nothing back to express worship to Jesus. Now, I want to leave for just a moment. And I want to begin the process of tying these two plans together and tying together these two pursuits of the advocates of each plan. Both of these plans, one for crucifixion and one for murder, they're brazen plans. Each plan on its own is shocking to us. That Jesus, the very Son of Man, would be handed over and die on a cross, a criminal's death, is shocking. And that Judas, who has been with Jesus, seen and experienced the pity and the compassion of Jesus, would for 30 pieces of silver turn him in to be unjustly murdered. Both of these plans are striking. But I want to conclude with this, the pursuits. And I want us to see that both of these pursuits are actually life-encompassing. Judas cannot sleep as he pursues the plan for murder. Judas has got to keep his eyes open all the time because he's looking for the right opportunity. He has been paid in advance. And if he doesn't deliver the goods, those who are after Jesus are going to be after him. Don't close your eyes, Judas. You better look for that opportunity. That is your new life goal. Judas is going to sit at the table with Jesus and hear the words of Passover meal that I'm about to share with you. And Judas is listening to those words, but his mind is wandering. Perhaps your minds are wandering right now. Judas is going to listen to Jesus describe what it means for the world to see a disciple of his. And Judas's mind is going to be elsewhere. Jesus is going to lead Judas into the Olivet Garden singing hymns. And Judas is going to be one of those people who moves their lips and maybe makes an occasional sound, but their heart is not in it. Judas has one job. Keep those eyes open to betray the Son of Man. The woman has one job too. I want you to understand, I want all of us to understand that this woman has in one moment abandoned vast amounts of wealth. As soon as that ointment is poured, she's not getting it back. Some of it will go into Jesus' clothing. Some of it will be soaked in the mats under the table. She's not getting it back. You know, as I said, the nard, it's in concentrated form. It would be cut with oil. And what she would use this nard for is she would mix it with oil, and it would be a medicine. It would be a doorway to health. She would mix some of the nard with oil, and it would be a means of showing great respect to a guest that arrives in your home. She would mix some oil with this nard, and she would prepare for great celebrations, personal celebrations even, the birth of a niece or a nephew. She would mix a little bit of oil with that nard, and it would be that which, well, she anoints the death of her own family members. And she breaks the flask and pours it out, never to be returned again. She has in that moment erased so many opportunities. Jesus to Mary is more valuable than her own health. She'll forego her health for the rest of her life in order to worship Jesus. Jesus is more important than any guest that will ever walk through the door of that house. This is the best guest that will ever be in this house. And she forgoes any opportunity to honor a future guest. There is no celebration down the road that is going to be greater than the celebration of Jesus' work for her salvation on the cross. There is no celebration that is that great. She's not going to need nard and oil for that celebration. This is the great celebration, greater than any other. And there will be no death in Mary's future. No death. A woman who knows what death and resurrection is like, having watched that in her own brother's life every day. But there is no death that is going to be as significant as this death. And so she breaks the flask. Now, Judas is consumed with that plan, and Mary is consumed with another plan. Do you think that any of this matters to you? Next week's Palm Sunday, and we'll practice some Holy Week music this afternoon to prepare. And we'll come together on Palm Sunday, and we'll commemorate Palm Sunday in our worship service. We'll watch kids with palm branches. And afterwards, we'll fellowship out on the lawn. We'll gather together Wednesday evening for prayer. We'll join a sister congregation Friday evening for hearing the story of the death of our Lord and Savior. And we'll come together on Easter Sunday, and we'll celebrate his resurrection. Why do we do this? Well, we're following the steps of this woman of verse 7. This woman is our pursuit as a church. What kind of church is King's Cross? You might ask if you're newer here. It's the kind of church that breaks an alabaster flask, empties all of our worldly hopes because we have Jesus. You see, Jesus, he pursues God's plan for crucifixion, and our response is her response, worship. And that is a response that we want everyone to see at King's Cross. God's plan is to join together his love and his justice in one magnificent event. We are the sinners. In many ways, we are the Judases. We are the ones who, without God's grace, are looking for the right opportunity, any opportunity, to assert our own will, choose our own destiny, achieve our own goals, line our own pockets. That's you, and that's me. And this pursuit of Judas must be punished. But in his love and in his mercy, God inflicts his wrath and judgment not on the Judases of the world, not on you and not on me, but on the innocent one, the only begotten Son, the very anointed of God, the Messiah of the world. And when that Son drinks that cup of wrath, there is now no condemnation for all of those who break their own flask. And during Holy Week, brothers and sisters, we want to mimic this woman. Because in verse 13, Jesus says that wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. Remember her. Church of Jesus Christ, the cross, the crucifixion is where your judgment was dealt with. And in his resurrected life is your life. Remember the flask. And those of you who aren't believers, take the flask and break the flask. The time is now. Nothing that you can earn in this world will compare to what Jesus has done for all those who place their trust in him on his cross. This woman, she has heard the plan of God that Jesus must die on the cross, and she puts all of her hope in that plan and breaks the flask, the plan for crucifixion. It's not her plan. Her plan would be just another version of pursuing the plan for murder. Jesus pursues God's plan, and our response is worship. And this sermon is reminding you, if you have not done it, break the flask. Would you join me in prayer?